As we continue our President's Day special, in this segment we focus on the power of the office and whether it's becoming more difficult for a president to more or less single-handedly change the nation. It's easy to look back at transformational presidents. We talked about FDR quite a bit this hour, who, for example, shifted the nation to a more progressive track here and clamped down on the power of American business without limits. 50 years later, another transformational president, Ronald Reagan, reversed many of the trends that FDR began, each man using their own personal popularity, media, and overall sense of power to get their way. Now, you can make the case no president has enjoyed that type of power since this president, who has faced what some would call unprecedented obstacles, including a huge partisan divide that's been well documented, led by Republican obstruction in Congress. So, to that end, Yannick, I'll ask you, the power of the presidency, is it different because we know more now, or that people haven't figured out to be the best practitioners of all the tools of today, like some of the other presidents did before them?
The powers or lack of powers have always been a source of frustration for presidents. Jimmy Carter, after leaving office, was once asked, were your powers less than you thought they would be? And he nodded his head as if saying amen immediately. So he felt this kind of frustration. You have to use the tools that are available to you as president. And I think one of Obama's deficits is his relations with Congress are not nearly as good as they should be. He doesn't engage in the kind of backslapping and invitations and just general communing with Congress that most presidents do. I was really struck by Bob Schieffer of CBS News saying that he didn't even know who Obama's congressional liaison person was. And that's a very important office in Washington, the president's congressional liaison. So you have to use tools like your congressional liaison folks, your strength with the media, speech making, the persuasive powers that are associated with the presidency. Those are the kinds of things that marshal your power. And Obama, I think we're still waiting for him to use some of those powers effectively.
But that's more on the official track, if you will. I mean, I think there's also a change in the what I'll call the unofficial power, the bully pulpit. I mean, Reagan and FDR both used the bully pulpit to such great effect that when the president was asking, citizens for their support on something, this is coming from the president. It seems today and in recent presidencies, when a president asks the American people for something, it's an instant divide, it's an instant debate. I don't know if maybe I'm misperceiving what my history says, but...
Well, I would say that Americans are a little more averse to the bully pulpit because Americans don't want to be preached to anymore. I do work in civil religion and the presidency, and it's much different. You can't get up and preach to the people anymore, as FDR liked to be, and as Theodore Roosevelt was in many ways. Now, all points are valid, all arguments are valid, and so a president has to respect all points of the issue, even if we never decide on anything.
Would that be the case for any president, or is it particular to the president? I mean, Jimmy Carter tried to use the bully pulpit with the Malaise speech, and it did not go particularly well at all. The next president seemed to have that bully pulpit, Ronald Reagan, much more at his disposal.
He did, but there was a lot of divisiveness under Reagan. I mean, there were people who loved him, people who couldn't stand him. Yeah, I'd like to see a movie that reflects both of those aspects.
But you know what? How do people think of him now? They think of him as the great communicator. And yes, some do, and some will say,
he's the great something else.
National debt doubled under his thing. But look, people know some of the stories of FDR, but one of the ones that I love that people don't realize is we had a Dust Bowl in this country. What did he do? He literally built an entire forest across the middle of America. I don't see, look, JFK took us to the moon, right? I mean, you can argue to get the Affordable Care Act passed, that was in itself a minor miracle. But my only point is, where did the thinking big, the huge challenges? I mean, FDR might have stacked the court. They probably would have tried to impeach him today for doing that. But what happened after it? The Supreme Court is a lot more amenable to some of the things that he was trying to get done. Yeah. Don't presidents have to be bigger? Even if they fail, even if they fall on their face, even if people argue that they do whatever, because of the sniping and the divisiveness and everything else, don't you just have to go for it more?
Well, I think as Andrew said, when you're talking about the two great communicators of the 20th century, you're talking about Roosevelt and you're talking about Reagan, and it's interesting, that Reagan is a great admirer of Roosevelt, voted for him 4 times, and and Reagan is responsible, most people don't know this, for the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington. It was really Reagan that got that project underway and made sure that it happened. But you know, I think there's a number of things, factors at work here. I think for one thing, we're really talking about leadership and qualities of leadership. Carter being one that you could say, you know, fell short, frankly. His relationship with Congress, it's interesting that that is very much a legacy of Jimmy Carter, the failed relationship with Congress. I think that same level of criticism could be leveled against President Obama, and it's interesting it doesn't come up as much. We're always looking for something else about President Obama. But you know, I think leadership involves appealing to people's emotions, and I think one of the great differences, say, between a Reagan and a Roosevelt and, say, a President Obama, and maybe to a certain extent Carter, is that they were appealing to people's their reasoning with the American public, and they're brilliant at it. I mean, Carter's speeches, Obama's speeches are brilliant in terms of there's this argument, there's that argument, there's this and there's that. He always lays out a very sophisticated point of view, whereas Roosevelt says the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, or you know, these economic royalists can't stand me and I welcome their hatred. I mean, he was appealing to the anxiety, the fear, the real trepidation that the
And
American
everybody
people
didn't
felt.
love him. They didn't love him
No,
back then.
no,
They don't love
but-
him now.
but
But
he
he
had enough
didn't
of
try to make them all love
He
him.
had enough of a consensus behind him, and so did Reagan, to take the country in a new direction. And that's that gift of leadership. Part of it is circumstance, the political circumstance at the time. And I just think President Obama, you know, entered the office, his personality and the circumstances didn't quite match. That's not really his fault. But
How much of that connection do you think is Rich and my fault, is the media's role in all of this? Because, I mean, FDR with the fireside chats, it was a one-way conversation, and yes, I know the debates continued in the newspaper. Reagan was best known for finding these amazing backdrops for his speech locations and getting the great soundbite. But then you get into the Clinton, Bush, Obama era, and it's the media landscape is much more divisive. It's all encompassing. It's 24/7. I mean,
But answer your own question, Andrew. With so many platforms, any president can get an audience at any time in any kind of medium they want, which is, I want to do it one way here. We'll put the camera in front of you, and then everyone else will get it. I mean, they can pick their spots.
Immediately after they're finished, the reaction starts and the chattering class starts, and in a way that FDR, the fireside chats, didn't have a Republican rebuttal coming after each one of those speeches. Reagan, when he had the great photo ops with the Grand Canyon behind him, didn't immediately have Teddy Kennedy coming out and saying, here's why Reagan's wrong. And I think in the landscape we have today, and I'm curious, Yannick, if you agree with me, instantly the president can do whatever he wants, say whatever he wants, and there's a litany of opponents and supporters who are ready to clog cable news.
Wasn't it always that way, though?
Well, it's gotten worse, the polarization and the 24-hour news cycle. But I think there's one common denominator to Roosevelt and to Reagan that's a key to leadership, and that is optimism. You have to project a kind of sunny optimism. Americans like to see hope and faith and optimism in their leaders, and they gravitate toward that. So you have the programmatic initiatives are one thing, but there's a sense of cheerfulness that you have to project onto the country.
Well, just like you found two people of two political parties that shared at least that communication skill, regardless of political parties, you take a look at this president, and no one can debate that the office has aged him. If you look at him now versus when he came in, like all his predecessors before him, it is amazing what the job will do to you. When we come back, we'll talk about the stresses attached to most powerful position in the free world.